In 1907, an explosion in a pair of coal mines in West Virginia killed 362 men within minutes, and most of them were not burned, but suffocated by the afterdamp that followed. What we saw in the mines of Appalachia was not a monster and not a mystery, but the full life cycle of an industrial system, born of hunger for fuel, raised in darkness, matured under regulation and machinery, and scarred by the arithmetic of methane, dust, and time. The problem that created it was simple and relentless: the demand for energy of a growing republic. By 1900, the United States produced roughly 270 million short tons of coal per year, much of it from the Appalachian Basin stretching from Pennsylvania to Alabama. A lesser-known fact is that in 1907 alone, the national coal mining death toll reached 3,242, a figure that pushed public anger toward federal intervention for the first time. Industry, railroads, steel mills, and city furnaces formed the parents of this system, and so did the doctrine of extraction that prized tonnage over margin. Appalachia was not one place, but a chain of fields: the bituminous seams of southern West Virginia, the Pocahontas No. 3 seam of Tazewell County in Virginia, the thick Pittsburgh seam under western Pennsylvania. A lesser-known design compromise shaped early operations. Many operators favored room and pillar layouts because they allowed rapid advance with minimal capital, even though they left behind 30 to 50% of coal as structural support, sacrificing recovery for speed and safety of the roof. Politics also stood nearby in the form of state laws that varied sharply in enforcement and inspection. In 1891, the federal government created a small division of mining statistics, but it had no regulatory power. Early decisions were made in timber and slate, not steel. Picks, black powder, and mules were the tools of childhood. A lesser-known production issue plagued these beginnings. Black powder shots often left smoldering pockets in coal faces, increasing the risk of methane ignition hours later when ventilation shifted. Ventilation itself was a fragile craft, depending on brattices of cloth and the steady turn of fan blades at the surface. Estimates vary on methane concentrations in poorly ventilated headings, but levels above 5% by volume were explosive, and miners carried open flame lamps into that margin. The childhood of the Appalachian mine was measured in coughs and timber creaks. Boys known as breaker boys sorted coal in Pennsylvania, some as young as 9, hands blackened before adolescence. A lesser-known crew training detail: in many camps, new miners were assigned to work beside experienced men for weeks without formal instruction, learning roof testing by the sound of a pick tap rather than by any written manual. Early failures were not abstract. They were roof falls that crushed a rib, or a misfired shot that left a hidden charge in a face. Small changes mattered more than grand inventions. The introduction of the safety lamp reduced ignition risk, but only when miners resisted the temptation to open it for better light. A lesser-known countermeasure adopted in some West Virginia mines before 1910 involved primitive water sprays at the cutting face to knock down coal dust, an improvisation born of observation rather than regulation. Coal dust was not just dirt, it was fuel, and by 1910, investigators increasingly recognized that explosions could propagate through dust even without high methane levels. The growth of this system came with steel rails underground and steel cages in shafts. By 1916, U.S. coal production had risen to about 597 million short tons. A lesser-known supply constraint shaped expansion during World War I. Shortages of experienced miners due to military enlistment forced companies to recruit immigrants and African American workers from the South, altering the demographic map of camps in southern West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. Standardization followed, slowly. After 1910, the creation of the U.S. Bureau of Mines marked a shift from statistics to science. The Bureau had no enforcement authority at first, but it had laboratories and a mandate to test. A lesser-known test result from early experiments at the Bureau's facility in Pittsburgh demonstrated that rock dusting, Spreading inert limestone dust on mine surfaces could stop the propagation of coal dust explosions by diluting combustible material below roughly 65%. Manuals began to circulate. Ventilation plans were drawn with measured airflow in cubic feet per minute, and inspectors learned to read them. Mass production of coal required a system around the face. Conveyor belts replaced some mule haulage, and electric cutting machines began to undercut seams in the 1910s and 1920s. A lesser-known production issue emerged with electrification. Electric cables for cutting machines were vulnerable to abrasion, and insulation failures sparked ignitions in gassy sections until stricter grounding and inspection regimes were adopted. Logistics meant timber supply, rail car scheduling, and the steady delivery of explosives under magazine rules. The mine became a choreography of shifts, often 2 or 3 per day, with whistles marking change. The camps that housed miners were part of the organism. Company towns controlled housing and stores, sometimes paying wages in scrip. A lesser-known medical effect of this system was the prevalence of hookworm and other parasitic diseases in early 20th century Appalachia, conditions that sapped stamina and made 12-hour shifts more punishing, documented by public health surveys in the 1910s. Organization grew in response. The United Miners of America expanded its reach, and strikes punctuated the rhythm of production. Weather and terrain shaped the growth in ways maps do not show. The narrow hollows of southern West Virginia limited surface facilities and forced tipples and rail spurs into tight alignments along creeks. A lesser-known weather impact, heavy spring rains increased the risk of water inflow through old workings, particularly where abandoned mines lay up-dip, leading to sudden inundations when barriers failed. Drainage tunnels and pumps became standard, measured in gallons per minute, their hum constant. Peak effectiveness of this system was not a single day, but an era when coal powered steel for war and electricity for cities. In 1947, U.S. coal production reached about 630 million short tons. A lesser-known command doctrine shift occurred during World War II, when the federal government temporarily seized mines in 1943 under the War Labor Disputes Act to maintain production, reflecting recognition of coal as strategic material. Mechanization accelerated after the war, with continuous miners introduced widely in the 1950s. Imagine a long-wall face in the 1960s, hydraulic shields advancing in sequence, shearer drums carving a clean arc across a seam. In some Appalachian operations, long-wall panels extended more than 10,000 feet in length. A lesser-known design compromise of longwall mining involved controlled subsidence at the surface. Allowing the roof to collapse behind the shields improved recovery rates above 70%, but altered drainage and damaged some structures above, a trade-off accepted for efficiency. Why it worked there was geology, relatively uniform seams of 4 to 8 feet in thickness, amenable to mechanized extraction. At peak, the system was feared for its power and loved for its wages. By the 1970s, some union miners earned incomes above national industrial averages. A lesser-known psychological effect of mechanization was a reported increase in perceived isolation among machine operators who worked within enclosed cabs or at remote panels, reducing the constant talk that had once defined hand-loading sections. The math of survival changed, too. Federal Coal Mine Health and Safety Act of 1969 set limits on respirable dust at 2 milligrams per cubic meter of air, a response to decades of black lung disease. The cost had been written long before the law. Between 1900 and 1969, more than 90,000 U.S. coal miners died in accidents. A lesser-known medical detail, pneumoconiosis or black lung, can progress even after exposure ends, as fibrotic changes in lung tissue continue. Autopsy studies in the mid-20th century documented advanced disease in retired miners who had left the mines years earlier. Fatigue was routine. Shifts of 10 to 12 hours in high heat were common before stricter limits. Injuries followed patterns. Roof falls were the leading cause of death in many decades, despite advances in roof bolting. A lesser-known battlefield improvisation, if that word may be borrowed, occurred underground when crews began installing additional temporary supports called breaker posts ahead of official roof bolting patterns in sections known for slick-insides, a local adaptation that reduced incidents before formal rules caught up. Fear had its own geometry, shaped by the memory of disasters like the 1968 Farmington explosion in West Virginia, which killed 78 miners and burned for days. The system learned, sometimes slowly. After Farmington, methane monitoring became more stringent, with required inspections at regular intervals and the installation of automatic shutoffs. A lesser-known countermeasure
In 2022, fewer than 40,000 people worked in U.S. coal mining, a fraction of the workforce that once filled the hollows of West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. The life of the mines of Appalachia had narrowed, not vanished, carrying forward habits of extraction into an era defined by transition and reckoning. The problem in this late chapter was no longer how to meet insatiable demand, but how to operate in a market where demand was shrinking and scrutiny was constant. Coal's share of U.S. electricity generation fell to around 20% by the early 2020s, down from roughly half in 2005. A lesser-known supply constraint in this period involved insurance and bonding requirements. As bankruptcies mounted, some operators faced higher premiums and stricter bonding for reclamation, limiting access to marginal reserves. Capital became cautious. Industry parents that once pushed expansion now weighed liability. Metallurgical coal for steelmaking sustained certain Appalachian operations, especially in southern West Virginia and southwest Virginia. A lesser-known test result from coal quality laboratories showed that specific Appalachian low-volatile coals retained high fluidity ranges in plastometer tests, a characteristic prized for coke blending, allowing select mines to command premium export prices even as thermal coal declined. Geography conferred a niche, not dominance. The terrain continued to assert itself. Thin seams required more cutting of surrounding rock, increasing wear on carbide bits and raising respirable silica levels in return air. A lesser-known medical effect documented in central Appalachia during the 2010s and early 2020s was the clustering of advanced black lung cases among relatively young miners with less than 20 years of tenure, associated with higher silica exposure from rock cutting in narrow seams. The disease that defined the childhood of the system reappeared in modern form. Training, once informal and passed hand to hand, became codified under federal oversight. New miners completed hours of classroom instruction and annual refreshers with modules on hazard recognition and emergency evacuation. A lesser-known crew training detail involved mandated hands-on drills with self-contained self-rescuers in simulated smoke conditions, designed to habituate muscle memory under stress rather than rely on recall in panic. The psychology of survival was engineered into routine. Technology promised vigilance. Continuous personal dust monitors provided near real-time exposure data, displayed in milligrams per cubic meter. A lesser-known production issue emerged when early models of these monitors required careful placement on the miner's belt to avoid airflow interference from body position, leading to revised guidance on orientation to ensure accurate sampling. Measurement, too, required maintenance. At the level of doctrine, the language shifted from compliance to culture. Companies spoke of zero harm, and regulators emphasized pattern of violations enforcement for repeat offenders. A lesser-known command doctrine shift involved data analytics applied to inspection histories, identifying clusters of citations across sections to predict where intervention might reduce risk before an accident occurred.
The mine became not only a workplace, but a data set. Weather and water remained persistent actors. In parts of Appalachia, legacy mines discharged acid mine drainage long after closure, with pH values sometimes below 3 in untreated outflows. A lesser-known countermeasure increasingly employed in reclamation projects was the use of constructed wetlands, engineered to promote passive treatment through limestone substrates and microbial activity, reducing acidity and metal concentrations without continuous chemical dosing. The hills learned to filter what they had been asked to give. The cost, even in decline, was not abstract. In 2010, the Upper Big Branch explosion killed 29 miners. In 2006, Sago killed 12. Between 2000 and 2020, hundreds more died in incidents large and small. A lesser-known psychological effect observed by researchers in Appalachian communities was the phenomenon of anticipatory grief among families during periods of heightened inspection or after nearby incidents, a stress pattern measurable in surveys even when no accident occurred locally. Memory shaped expectation. Economics redrew maps of identity. Counties once defined by tipples and bathhouses faced unemployment rates above national averages when mines closed. A lesser-known supply constraint in local economies involved the decline of severance tax revenues tied to coal production, reducing funding for schools and infrastructure in some states, and accelerating population outmigration. The mine's aging echoed in empty classrooms. Yet replacement was uneven. Natural gas and renewables expanded, but metallurgical coal exports fluctuated with global steel cycles. In 2021, a rebound in global steel demand lifted some Appalachian operations. A lesser-known weather impact during that period included flooding events that disrupted rail lines in West Virginia, temporarily constraining shipments despite high prices, reminding operators that logistics remained vulnerable to climate and terrain. The chain from seam to ship was only as strong as its lowest bridge. Old portals were sealed with concrete, but new safety designs remained embedded in practice. Refuge alternatives rated for at least 96 hours stood in by the portals of active mines. A lesser-known design compromise in these chambers involved balancing oxygen supply duration with size and weight constraints, resulting in modular units that could be moved through low-clearance entries but required strict maintenance schedules to ensure integrity of carbon dioxide scrubbers. Survival was a calculation of volume and time. Research continued in laboratories far from the face. The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health studied rock dust particle distributions to optimize explosion suppression. A lesser-known test result indicated that finer rock dust particles improved inerting effectiveness, but were more prone to caking in high humidity, leading to revised guidelines on application rates and reapplication intervals in damp sections. Even dust had a biography. Communities carried forward traditions. Oral histories recorded by universities preserved accounts of hand-loading and of the first continuous miners arriving in hollows. A lesser-known cultural detail is the persistence of mine rescue competitions across the region, where teams practice simulated disaster scenarios under timed conditions in reinforcing skills and camaraderie even as the number of active mines declines. The craft seeks continuity. In this late chapter, the system no longer grows. It manages decline, seeks niches, and measures risk with precision unimaginable in 1907. A lesser-known command doctrine shift across parts of the industry has been the integration of contractor management systems that apply the same safety standards to subcontractors as to direct employees, responding to data that showed elevated injury rates in contract labor in certain periods. Responsibility widened. What we saw in the mines of Appalachia across more than a century was adaptation under constraint. Production tables rose and fell. Fatalities dropped from thousands per decade to dozens per year. Dust limits tightened, sensors multiplied. A lesser-known medical initiative in recent years has been expanded federal funding for black lung clinics in Appalachian states, increasing access to screening and benefits assistance for miners and their families, acknowledging a debt carried forward. The organism that once seemed permanent now lives in selective seams and in memory. Reclaimed slopes host saplings, former rail beds become trails, some former miners retrain for other trades. A lesser-known weather and terrain impact persists in subsidence-prone areas where long-wall extraction altered groundwater pathways, requiring ongoing monitoring of wells and surface water decades after panels were mined. The past remains active underground. There is no dramatic extinction, only transition. Coal from Appalachia still moves in unit trains to ports and mills, still glows in coke ovens, still powers some plants. A lesser-known production legacy lies in the standardized reporting of near-miss incidents mandated in many operations, a practice that has influenced safety management in other extractive industries worldwide. The lessons traveled. The quiet moral line at the end of this long life is not condemnation and not praise. It is recognition. Energy is drawn from somewhere by someone under rules written and rewritten in response to loss and learning. What we saw in the mines of Appalachia across more than a century was adaptation under constraint. Production tables rose and fell. Fatalities dropped from thousands per decade to dozens per year. Dust limits